I don't know who this is for today, but I need to tell you, God is already handling it. You're sitting there losing sleep, running scenarios in your mind, trying to figure out what only God can fix. But can I remind you of something? The battle was never yours to fight. You've been stressing over things God already has under control. While you're overthinking, heaven is already working. While you're doubting, God is already delivering. So today, I need you to take a deep breath, release the weight, and trust that God has already gone before you. If you believe it, somebody shout amen. God has already gone before you. Trust His plan. Before you even knew there was a problem, before you even realized you needed a breakthrough, God was already at work. He has already mapped out your path, orchestrated the right connections, and set divine appointments that you haven't even walked into yet. But the challenge is that when we can't see the full picture, we start doubting if there even is one. We feel stuck in a situation, thinking we have to figure everything out on our own, but God has already gone ahead of us. When the Israelites stood before the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army closing in behind them, they panicked. They saw an impossible situation, but God had already planned their escape before they even knew they needed one. The sea wasn't going to part when they were still in Egypt. It was going to part when they stepped forward in faith. That's how God works. He doesn't always show us the whole plan, because if He did, we'd either try to take control or run away in fear. Instead, He calls us to trust Him in the moment, knowing He has already made a way. We struggle with trust because we want to see proof before we believe. But faith is trusting God even when we don't have all the details. It's knowing that if God is leading us, He has already prepared the way. He sees what we can't see. He knows what's coming next. He is not reacting to our situation. He has already written the script. The very thing that has you worried right now is something God has already worked out in the spiritual realm. Just because you don't see the answer yet, doesn't mean it isn't coming. Think about how a GPS works. When you enter a destination, it already knows the entire route. It may not show you every turn in advance, but as long as you follow the directions, you'll get to where you need to be. God is the same way. He knows where you're going. He knows the detours you'll face. He knows the delays that will happen, but none of it surprises Him because He has already calculated the way forward. The only thing that can throw you off course is if you stop trusting Him and try to find your own way. When we overthink and try to control everything, we step out of alignment with God's plan. We stress ourselves out trying to open doors that God never intended for us to walk through. We become anxious about things that God has already resolved in the future. Our minds race with what ifs and worst case scenarios, but God is saying, I've got this. I've already handled it. The problem is not that God isn't moving, it's that we're not trusting. Abraham is a perfect example of what happens when we try to force something that God has already planned. God promised him a son, but when it didn't happen in the timeline he expected, he and Sarah took matters into their own hands. The result was Ishmael, a situation that created unnecessary complications, but God had already planned for Isaac to be born at the right time. The promise was always coming. They just needed to trust. How many times do we create unnecessary stress and heartache because we think God is taking too long? How many times do we settle for less because we don't believe God is still working? When we trust that God has already gone before us, we stop striving. We stop trying to manipulate outcomes. We stop exhausting ourselves with worry. We start walking in confidence, knowing that even when things look uncertain, our future is secure in His hands. Trusting God doesn't mean there won't be challenges. It doesn't mean there won't be moments of doubt, but it means we choose to rest in the truth that God has already made a way. Even in the waiting, even in the silence, even when nothing seems to be happening, God is moving behind the scenes. Overthinking is the enemy of faith. Let it go. The mind is a battlefield where countless thoughts wage war every single day. Doubts, fears, and endless scenarios play out in a loop, keeping you trapped in cycles of anxiety. Overthinking doesn't give you control. It only drains your peace. It magnifies problems, making them seem bigger than they actually are, while shrinking your faith. Instead of trusting God, you end up trusting your worries, giving them more power than they deserve. Overthinking is rooted in the need for certainty. The mind wants to predict every possible outcome, but faith was never about having all the answers. Faith is about surrendering the need to know everything and choosing to trust the one who does. The moment you start overanalyzing, you step into a place of fear instead of faith. Fear whispers, "What if it doesn't work out?" Faith declares, "God has already made a way." Fear makes you feel like you have to figure it all out on your own. Faith reminds you that God is already handling it. When Peter stepped out of the boat to walk on water, he was fine as long as he kept his eyes on Jesus. But the moment he started looking at the waves, calculating how deep the water was, and questioning if he could really do it, he started sinking. That's what overthinking does. It drowns you in doubt. You start focusing on the obstacles instead of the one who called you. The more you analyze, the less you trust. The more you question, the more fear takes over. The very thing God called you to do becomes impossible, not because it was ever impossible, but because your thoughts convinced you it was. Overthinking is exhausting because it never stops at just one thought. It leads to another, then another, creating endless what-if scenarios that steal your joy. You start imagining every possible way things could go wrong, rehearsing conversations in your head, preparing for problems that may never even happen. Instead of living in the present, you're consumed with fears about the future. Instead of trusting God's plan, you're busy creating backup plans. But what if you let go? What if you chose to release the need to control and simply believe that God is already ahead of you? Martha was a classic overthinker. When Jesus visited her home, she was anxious about making everything perfect. She was consumed with details, worried about serving, while Mary simply sat at Jesus' feet and listened. Martha's overthinking distracted her from the very presence of God. That's what happens when we allow our minds to be consumed with unnecessary worries. We miss what God is doing right in front of us. While we're analyzing, stressing, and planning, we're missing the peace that comes from just being still and trusting. Overthinking also leads to indecision. When you analyze every option, afraid of making the wrong choice, you end up making no choice at all. You stay stuck waiting for absolute certainty. But faith doesn't require certainty, it requires trust. God isn't asking you to have it all figured out before you move forward. He's asking you to take the step, even when you don't know the whole plan. Overthinking will convince you that you need more time, more clarity, more confirmation, when in reality, you just need to move in faith. One of the enemy's greatest tactics is to keep you trapped in your own thoughts. If he can get you to overthink, he can get you to hesitate. If he can get you to hesitate, he can get you to doubt. And if he can get you to doubt, he can get you to stop trusting God altogether. But you don't have to live in that cycle. The moment you recognize that your overthinking is robbing you of peace, you have the power to break free. You don't have to entertain every thought that enters your mind. You don't have to analyze every detail. You don't have to solve every problem on your own. The mind will always try to fill in the gaps when you don't have all the answers. It will try to make sense of what God is doing, even when you're not meant to understand it yet. But some things aren't meant to be figured out. They're meant to be trusted. Overthinking doesn't add to your faith, it takes from it. It keeps you stuck in fear when God is calling you to move forward in confidence. The key is not in controlling every outcome, but in trusting the one who holds every outcome in his hands. Worry doesn't change the outcome, prayer does. Worry is a cycle that drains your energy, fills your mind with fear, and keeps you stuck in a place of anxiety. It convinces you that if you think about something long enough, you can control it. But the truth is, worry has never solved a problem, never healed a broken heart, and never moved a mountain. It only steals your peace and keeps you from seeing what God is doing. Prayer, on the other hand, shifts your focus from the problem to the one who holds the solution. When you choose to pray instead of worry, you step into a place of trust, surrendering the situation into God's hands instead of carrying it on your own. Worry comes from a place of fear, but prayer comes from a place of faith. When you worry, you are meditating on the problem, but when you pray, you are meditating on God's promises. Worry keeps your mind in a loop of negative possibilities, but prayer reminds you that God is greater than anything you are facing. The Bible says in Philippians 4:6, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. That means the moment you feel anxiety rising, you have a choice. You can let worry take over, or you can bring it to God in prayer. Worry tricks you into thinking you are doing something productive. You replay conversations, imagine worst-case scenarios, and try to figure out every possible outcome. But no matter how much you think about a problem, it doesn't change the situation. It only leaves you feeling more overwhelmed. Jesus said in Matthew 6:27, can any one of you by worrying add a single hour to your life? Worry doesn't add, it takes away. It takes away your peace, your sleep, your joy, and your ability to hear from God clearly. Prayer, on the other hand, aligns your heart with God's will. It shifts your focus from the things you can't control to the one who is in control of everything. When you worry, you carry burdens that you were never meant to carry. You try to figure out how everything will work out instead of trusting that God has already made a way. But prayer is an act of release. It is saying, God, I can't handle this on my own, but I trust that you can. It's shifting from self-reliance to God-reliance. It's choosing to let go instead of holding on to stress and fear. Worry magnifies the problem, but prayer magnifies God's power. The enemy wants to keep you stuck in worry because he knows that when you pray, things start to shift. Worry keeps you in a place of fear, but prayer moves you into a place of faith. It's not about using the perfect words or having everything figured out. It's about bringing your heart before God and trusting Him to work in ways that you can't see. The moment you pray, you invite God into the situation. You give Him permission to move in His way and in His timing. Worry tries to control, but prayer surrenders. There's a reason why Jesus constantly told His disciples not to worry. He knew that worry would keep them distracted and discouraged. He knew that the weight of anxiety would keep them from stepping into the fullness of what God had for them. That's why He said in Matthew 6:34, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. When you worry about tomorrow, you miss what God is doing today. Worry makes you focus on what ifs, but prayer keeps you grounded in what is true. The enemy would love for you to waste your days stressing over things that are already in God's hands. He would love for you to stay up at night overanalyzing situations that God has already worked out. But the moment you stop worrying and start praying, you take back your peace. You remind yourself that God is not only aware of what you are facing, but He is also already working on your behalf. The situation may not change overnight, but your mindset will. When you pray, you are no longer carrying the burden alone. You are placing it in the hands of the one who can actually do something about it. God's timing is perfect. Stop trying to rush it. One of the hardest things to do in life is wait. Waiting feels like nothing is happening, like time is being wasted, like prayers are going unanswered. But just because you don't see movement doesn't mean God isn't working. His timing is not like ours. He is never early, never late, but always right on time. The problem is that we live in a world that thrives on instant gratification. We want things now, on our terms, in our way, but God sees the bigger picture. He knows what we're ready for and what we're not. He knows when the blessing will help us and when it will hurt us. He knows what needs to be put in place before we step into what He has for us. When we try to rush God, we step out of alignment with His will. We start making decisions based on impatience rather than wisdom. We force things that were never meant to be forced. We try to open doors that God has intentionally kept closed. Sarah and Abraham did this when they decided to take matters into their own hands. God had promised them a son, but when it didn't happen in their timing, they created their own solution. Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham and Ishmael was born, but that wasn't God's promise. That was their impatience trying to force something that God had already planned in his perfect timing, and their decision brought unnecessary struggle and conflict into their lives. How many times do we do the same thing? We grow tired of waiting, so we settle. We take the job that isn't right, enter the relationship that isn't from God, or rush into opportunities we aren't ready for. But every time we try to make something happen on our own, we create stress and struggle that could have been avoided. God isn't withholding from us. He is protecting us. He is preparing us. He is making sure that when the blessing comes, we are ready to receive it. There is a reason why certain doors haven't opened yet. There is a reason why things haven't fallen into place the way you imagined. It's not because God has forgotten about you. It's not because he isn't listening. It's because he is working behind the scenes in ways you can't see. He is setting things up in the spiritual realm that will be revealed in the natural at the right time. If you rush ahead, you may miss what he is doing. You may step outside of his plan and end up with something less than what he had for you. God's timing isn't just about the blessing itself. It's about what he is doing in you while you wait. There is a process of preparation that happens in the waiting season. God is building your character, strengthening your faith, and teaching you things that you will need when you step into your next season. If you skip the process, you won't be ready for the promise. David was anointed as king long before he ever sat on the throne. He had to go through years of preparation, facing battles, growing in leadership, and developing the heart of a king. If he had rushed ahead, he wouldn't have been ready for the position God had for him. Waiting is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. It is in the waiting that trust is developed. It is in the waiting that faith is strengthened. It is in the waiting that we learn to depend on God rather than our own understanding. The enemy will try to convince you that if it hasn't happened yet, it's never going to happen. He will whisper lies that God has forgotten about you, that your prayers are being ignored, that you need to take matters into your own hands. But faith says, I trust God's timing even when I don't understand it. Faith says, I believe that what God has for me is worth the wait. There is peace in surrendering to God's timing. There is rest in knowing that you don't have to force anything. You don't have to chase after what God has already prepared for you. What is meant for you will not pass you by. When it is time, doors will open that no man can shut. Opportunities will come together in ways you never could have orchestrated on your own. What seemed delayed will prove to be right on time. God's ways are higher than ours, and his timing is always perfect. Peace comes when you surrender, not when you figure everything out. The reason so many people are stressed, anxious, and overwhelmed is because they are trying to carry things they were never meant to carry. They are trying to solve problems that belong in God's hands. They are trying to predict the future, control the outcome, and make sense of things that don't make sense yet. But true peace is not found in knowing all the answers. It is found in surrendering to the one who does. It is found in saying, God, I don't have to understand everything to trust that you are working everything for my good. The more you try to control, the more frustrated you become. Life is unpredictable, and no amount of overanalyzing can change that. There will always be things beyond your understanding, situations that don't go according to plan, and moments that don't make sense. But the good news is, God is never caught off guard. He is never surprised. What confuses you is already clear to him. What overwhelms you is already handled by him. Your job is not to figure it all out. Your job is to trust him through it. Surrender is not about giving up. It is about letting go of the need to control what only God can control. It is about saying, God, I release this into your hands. I trust your plan more than I trust my own understanding. Proverbs 3:05-6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight." That means you don't have to have it all mapped out. You don't have to stress over every detail. You just have to follow where he leads and trust that he is guiding you the right way. There is a difference between surrender and passivity. Surrender is not sitting back and doing nothing. It is actively choosing to trust God while taking steps in obedience. It is doing what you can and leaving the rest to him. When the Israelites were trapped between Pharaoh's army and the Red Sea, they had to take a step of faith before the waters parted. They had to move forward in trust before they saw the miracle. That is what surrender looks like. Moving forward even when you don't have all the answers. Believing that God is making a way even when you can't see it yet. Jesus modeled surrender in the most powerful way when he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. He knew the suffering that was ahead, but instead of trying to resist it or change it, he surrendered to the Father's will. He said, "Not my will, but yours be done." That is the ultimate act of trust, releasing your plans, your timeline, and your expectations, and choosing to say, "God, I trust that your way is better." Peace comes when you stop fighting against what God is doing and start flowing with it. The reason so many people lack peace is because they are constantly wrestling with God instead of resting in him. They are trying to open doors that he has closed, trying to change things that are out of their control, trying to hold on to things that he is asking them to release. But the moment you truly surrender, something shifts. The weight lifts, the stress fades, the fear loses its grip, because you realize you were never meant to carry it all on your own. Surrendering to God doesn't mean everything will suddenly make sense. It doesn't mean all your questions will be answered overnight, but it does mean that you will have peace in the midst of uncertainty. It means you can breathe again knowing that God is in control. It means you can stop striving, stop overanalyzing, stop trying to force things to happen, and simply trust that he is working everything out in ways that are far beyond what you can see right now. The enemy wants to keep you in a constant state of worry because he knows that when you surrender to God, you step into a peace that he can't touch. He knows that when you truly trust God, you stop reacting out of fear and start walking in faith. That's why he fills your mind with doubts, tries to make you believe that surrendering is the same as losing, and convinces you that if you don't figure everything out, things will fall apart. But the truth is, the moment you surrender, things start falling into place in ways you never expected. God never asked you to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. He never asked you to solve every problem on your own. He simply asks you to trust him, to release the need to understand everything, to lay your burdens at his feet, because true peace doesn't come from having all the answers. It comes from knowing the one who does. God is already working behind the scenes even when you can't see it. One of the biggest struggles in faith is trusting that God is moving when there is no visible evidence, when nothing seems to be changing, when the situation looks the same, when prayers feel like they are going unanswered. It is easy to wonder if God is even doing anything at all. But just because you don't see it doesn't mean he's not working. Some of the greatest miracles happen in the unseen. Some of the most powerful breakthroughs begin long before there is any sign of them in the natural. Think about a seed buried in the ground. If you judged it based on what you see on the surface, you would think nothing is happening. The soil looks the same day after day. But under the surface, the seed is breaking open, roots are spreading, and something is beginning to grow. Just because you don't see the sprout yet doesn't mean growth isn't taking place. That is how God works. He moves in the unseen before the evidence shows up in the scene. He is setting things in motion that you can't even comprehend yet. The story of Joseph is a perfect example of this. Joseph had dreams of greatness, but his reality looked nothing like those dreams. He was sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. If he had judged his situation based on what he could see, he might have believed that God had forgotten him. But all along, God was working behind the scenes. Every betrayal, every setback, every delay was actually positioning him for the promise. When the time was right, he was elevated to a position of power, and everything God had spoken over his life came to pass. Sometimes what looks like a setback is actually a setup. Sometimes what seems like a delay is really divine preparation. If you only focus on what you can see, you will miss what God is doing beneath the surface. That's why faith is so important. Faith is trusting that God is working even when there is no evidence yet. Faith is believing that He is making a way even when the path isn't visible. Hebrews 11:01 says, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." That means your confidence isn't based on what things look like, it's based on who God is. The enemy wants to keep you discouraged by making you focus only on what is visible. He wants you to think that nothing is changing, that God isn't moving, that your prayers aren't making a difference. But just because you can't see the full picture doesn't mean God isn't painting it. Just because you don't have all the details doesn't mean He isn't writing the story. There is always more happening than you realize. Look at the story of Elijah and his servant in 2 Kings 6. The servant saw an army surrounding them and panicked. But Elijah prayed for his eyes to be opened, and suddenly the servant saw what had been there all along. Heaven's army surrounding them, greater than the enemy. The protection had always been there, but the servant couldn't see it until his eyes were opened. Sometimes we need that same revelation. We need to realize that God is already moving, already surrounding us, already working things out. Think about Daniel when he prayed for 21 days. He didn't see an answer right away, but what he didn't know was that from the moment he prayed, God had already sent the answer. In Daniel 10:12, the angel tells him, "From the first day that you set your heart to understand and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come because of your words." The answer was on the way the whole time, but there was spiritual warfare delaying it. Just because something isn't happening as fast as you want doesn't mean it's not happening at all. God doesn't waste anything. Every season of waiting, every moment of confusion, every unanswered question is still part of His plan. He is working in ways that are beyond what you can comprehend. He is aligning the right people, shifting circumstances, opening doors that no one can shut. And when the time is right, everything He has been preparing will be revealed. You don't have to see it to believe it. You don't have to understand it to trust it. Your job is not to figure out how everything will come together. It is simply to have faith that God is already putting the pieces in place. Just because you can't see progress doesn't mean progress isn't happening. Some of God's greatest work happens in the unseen.